Ivelyse, Andino, Ivelyse in Spanish. I was born in the Bronx, and everywhere I go I talk about being from the Bronx because I'm incredibly proud, but I think that's new. Because when I was growing up and I was applying for jobs, I would never, ever, ever put that I was from the Bronx on my resume. In fact, I would change it, so it would say things like Throgs Neck or New York, New York, and I'd make it up. And the reason why, anyone know why? I wouldn't get a job, no one would call me back if I was from the Bronx. So talking about a lot of the structural, the racism, the things that happen. And so when I was growing up, I thought I was going to be a doctor. That didn't work out. I ended up working in healthcare, so I worked for biopharmaceutical companies. And again, in all of those resumes and all of those applications, I never put the Bronx. What I didn't know then, or maybe what I subconsciously knew, is that where I lived and my zip code really determined, my life, and it impacted my job opportunities. But it really also impacted my health. And so, for those of you, who don't know, 80% of your health is influenced by where you live. In the slides earlier, I think almost all of us touched on the social determinants of health. But this is a big reality. And the pieces that I think go into this, right, are, it's where this is more so, it impacts your health more so than genetics, more so than your actual DNA. But where you live and your zip code will determine, how long you live and all these other important things. And so when I got into healthcare, I already knew that where I lived was not going to impact my job as well. But I thought that if I made it, I would be fine, right? So my job was to work for large biopharmaceutical companies, and as drugs were released from the FDA, I had to train physicians and researchers on these drugs. And it was incredible, because here I am, this young girl from the Bronx, I'm making it, I had fancy suits and an office, and it was great. I managed millions of dollars in budget. And I thought that was my path, and I thought, hey, I'll be fine. But what happened was, while I was doing that, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And for me, it was really eye-opening, because I found myself in a Bronx hospital that was very gray and dark, if we're talking about built environments. But it didn't matter how much money I made, it didn't matter how smart I was, it didn't matter that my mom also worked in healthcare and with health insurers. The system itself was really not designed to be easy to navigate, or even with our best interests at heart. And it was in that moment that I realized, oh wow, this healthcare system as a whole really isn't designed for me. And it was in that moment where I had, we talked about it earlier, right, this cognitive dissonance of what is happening here? What is happening with where I live, where I work, how I engage with these systems, and why doesn't it work for me? And when I say me, I mean us. And when I say us, I mean people of color, black and brown folks, those who have been historically marginalized, LGBTQI, veterans, folks with disabilities. Why doesn't this system work for us? And it was then that I had this awakening, and also MLK talked about this. In the funny, I'm trying to keep you guys awake. In 1966, speaking to the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and MLK Jr. said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And I think that makes sense today. And if we start to redefine what healthcare looks like, and we start talking about health, and when we start talking about health, a big fun piece that we do, and I'll talk about what we do at Radical Health, but maybe we'll do this here as a quick exercise. If you could turn to your neighbor, I'm gonna ask you a question, just turn to your neighbor and talk about this for 2 seconds, because I don't have a lot of time. But what does health mean to you? So just chat up, see the close next to you, just give your definition of health. What does health mean to you? I hope you introduced yourself. We can yell at a time, you know, popcorn style. What does health mean to you? So there's someone who's still talking, so we're gonna make you go first here in the front. Okay, what does health mean? What did we come up with? A balance. Over here. Freedom. Apathy. Oh. Is that what you said? Apathy?
Happy.
Oh, happy. I was like, okay. Happy. Interaction. Any others?
Wholeness.
What else?
Food.
Integrity. There was one up here. Good food. Community. Any others? Yeah. All right, that's what I thought. No, there's a whole many things, right? And the definitions of health, right, really, one, vary on where you are, vary where you are in life, and it's not this finite definition. It always evolves. And so this is where I maybe might talk about the curve cutouts, but basically, you know, depending on where you are, if I, you know, sprain my ankle right now, hopefully I don't do that, right? I'm gonna have a very different definition of what health means, because I'm gonna think about accessibility and the ramp walking up here. There was like a nice ramp that you could walk around, but there's a steep ramp. I went up the steep ramp coming up. But my definition of health will change, right? If I'm pregnant, or if I have to care for a parent or a child, our definitions of health change. And when we start to look at this definition of health, we can look at it from all forms, from the clinical perspective of going to a hospital, from the carceral system, in how we as in the US incarcerate massive numbers of people, to immigration, to education, to where we live, to where we stand. And what I started doing, so I had this big, you know, revelation of like, it's just not fair. And in all these spaces, they're not designed with equity in mind. And for me, I left the pharma, surprise, I left the pharma area and I started to get into tech. And it was great because I said, here I am again, doing the thing where I was creating apps and I was letting doctors prescribe apps to patients. But I found in that same moment, I was having the same challenges of, this isn't fair. We're creating innovation, we're creating these technologies. But where I live, in the South Bronx, we definitely didn't have any doctors prescribing apps. But the quality of care, let alone the innovation, just the quality of care really lacked. And so for me, I began to say, how can we start to change this? And so I could sit in a room, you know, we could sit in this room and come up with like, okay, the community wants better doctors, and they keep talking about access to food, so maybe we can make a food garden. And more recently, they've been talking about, you know, the courtyards in their buildings, so let's design better courtyards. But every time, when I was doing this at Tech, every time I was coming up with those answers and solutions, and then we never brought them to the community, but we weren't getting the adoption, or we were spending all this money and no one would use what we were building. And so it was then that I said, this just isn't right. What we're doing is not right. And in fact, if we want to look at health, and we want to look at equity, and we want to make real change, it's not up to me, with my privilege, to like come up with these ideas, and or I was often the only woman in the room and the only person of color. I can't represent everyone that is not, you know, who's in the room. We have to be on the ground. And so I left my fancy job and I started a company called Radical Health. And yes, thank you. And you know, that's fun. But what was really fun about that was that I wanted to look at health differently. And so I invited everyone I knew, and I tricked them, if I'm honest. And I said, come to my house and we're gonna have some hors d'oeuvres and wine. It'll be so much fun. And then they got there and it was a conversation, very much like what I had y'all doing here. Like, what does health mean to you? And if you had a magic wand, what would that look like? And to be fair, everyone there, I mean, they were my friends, but it was also my cousin, it was my next door neighbor, folks who were like, you know, in the healthcare industry, people who were, you know, just moms and teachers, whatever, anyone who came over. And we started talking about what would health look like. And that's where this idea of radical health came from. And then we had these meetings every month. And then we started growing out of I live in New York, right, so my apartment isn't very big. We started growing out of my apartment. then we needed to rent space, and people were asking, like, we need this. We need to come together, not just as health professionals, not just as educators, not just as designers, not just as like people and neighbors. We need to come together and break out of these silos and start talking and start sharing our lived experiences, learning. And so I didn't know, I was trying to raise money, I was trying to build another tech company, I had no idea what I was doing, to be completely honest. But then this just started taking off, and then people were like, hey, can you come to my organization and can you talk with, you know, my people about health? And I was like, well, all right, sure. And so I would go out into like a music program where they served undocumented young students, and they taught them how to play classical music and jazz. And the amount of like interest and like support and the instructors like, wow, like not just the students but the parents, they really are yearning to talk, and they keep asking us all these questions about what doctor to see and how they can get help, you know, like help. But we just teach the cello. I feel like this isn't my thing. And so we got to come in and just talk. And so what we do at Radical Health is we look at health equity through meaningful conversations and tech. And so we have a big focus on people. And this should have been an animated slide, so just bear with me on this, just the people here. But we focus on people, and so we host and we facilitate conversations, and we create space for people to talk about health, to define health. We do it using indigenous practice of circles, so restorative health circles are what we call it. And we get to come together and talk, you know, dive deep about gun violence, or talk about, right now we're doing some stuff around opioid overdoses. And the funny thing that happens when you bring people together and let them talk, as you did, is that you start sharing, you start creating. When we do work around the overdose crisis, what we're finding is that people don't use the word opioid. In fact, even for the clinicians and the folks who, like myself, like I have a really hard time defining opioids. Sure, I know what it is in a chemical sense, but what does it actually mean? And in fact, we use the words like drugs or get high, and we have all of these words that mean something to us, but don't really mean, we don't use the system language. And so in this process, we get to hear from folks, we get to create folks, we then get to build networks of people. And I want to be honest that we're not creating anything that's brand new. These networks of people have been there, they just sometimes need help in talking. I mean, we're all here, right? But no one, I don't think anyone introduced themselves to one another. And so with Radical Health, we get to do that. And we get to build and foster this idea of community building, and we get to see on the ground how that happens. And then we were having these workshops, and we were like, well, how do we keep this going? And I'm a firm believer, and I come from the tech background, that if you build it, they won't come, and tech is not the answer to everything. Talk me after. But I was like, how could we use tech in a way that supplements the people-to-people connection? And so what we did for a special group is that we built out an app that uses AI, and we can talk about all the horrible things about AI, but we use this chatbot that helps people ask questions before they go in for an appointment with their doctors. And if we think about the questions, if you're ever picking dinner, I would say that we spend more time picking out what we're going to eat from the menu than we do preparing for an appointment. But there's always those questions that you think you're going to ask. They're the questions that you actually ask. And then, I know for me, I always walk out and there's that one question that I'm like, damn it, I should have asked that. And what we use through our chatbot is helping people ask those questions. And let's say that we don't have that question in our chatbot, or you want to talk about something else, we then connect you with a real peer that is chatting with you real time and helping to build trust and listening to what's happening. And so at Radical Health, our theory, right, is that people plus tech is what equals change. And I invite you all, as you think about the work that you're doing, there was a show of hand of where everyone is coming from. When we look at mental health, right, and I didn't use that word in this presentation because, again, our communities we don't use the word mental health. We talk about health. We talk about living. We talk about connection and happiness. And so combining those pieces together, listening to folks on the ground, using the tools that are in front of you, but then also adapting them and making sure that we're conscious of our privilege is where we think the future of both health, of community, and I think this collaboration that doesn't necessarily need to change much, but when we start to build together is what will be the fruit, right? And the joy, and ultimately the connection of our communities. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but thank you.